The sound hit the room before anyone understood what happened. A sharp, flat crack, the kind that doesn't belong in a hospital, split through the noise of monitors and rolling carts and low voices, and for one full second, every person in the emergency department of Hargrove Medical Center stopped moving. COO Marcus Del Rey had just slapped a nurse across the face in front of 30 witnesses. She didn't fall. She didn't cry. She turned her head back slowly, touched two fingers to the corner of her mouth where blood was already forming, and looked at him with the kind of stillness that didn't belong to someone who was scared. It belonged to someone who was calculating. No one in that room knew her name was Lieutenant Commander Nora Voss, or that she had once pulled a dying rear admiral out of black water off the coast of a country the government still doesn't officially acknowledge. They were about to find out. If this story already has you gripped, follow along until the very end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story can travel. The shift had started badly before Marcus Del Rey ever walked through the door. It was a Tuesday in late October, and Hargrove Medical Center's emergency department was operating at 114% capacity, which was the kind of number that looked clean on a report and looked like controlled chaos in real life. Gurneys were parked in hallways. A man with a probable hairline fracture in his left wrist sat in a plastic chair near the vending machines because there were no available exam rooms. Two nurses had called out sick, which meant the three who showed up were running between patients with the focused, tunnel vision efficiency that comes from years of doing more with less and never quite getting used to it. Nora Voss was one of those three. She was 41, though most people guessed younger, and she had the kind of face that didn't give much away. Not cold exactly, just contained, like someone who had learned a long time ago that reacting and responding were two entirely different things. She'd been working at Hargrove for 6 years, the last 4 of those in the emergency department, and she was good at her job in the way that mattered most in an ER. She didn't freeze, she didn't guess when she didn't know the answer, and she didn't spend time on things that weren't going to help the patient in front of her. Her colleagues liked her well enough, in the measured way you like someone you respect but don't entirely know. She wasn't the type who came to birthday lunches in the break room or forwarded memes in the department group chat, but she had stayed 3 hours past the end of a shift to help a new nurse work through a complicated chart, and she remembered patients' family members by name when they came back, which in an emergency room is the kind of thing that tells you more about a person than almost anything else. What they didn't know about her, what nobody at Hargrove knew because she had kept it quiet deliberately and without drama, was that before the scrubs and the badge and the long double shifts, Nora Voss had spent 11 years in the United States Navy as a combat medical officer attached to special operations units. She had worked in environments that weren't supposed to exist on paper. She had made decisions under conditions that most people would struggle to describe without it sounding like fiction. She didn't talk about it. Not because it was shameful, but because it was finished, and because the person she had been then was not the person she was trying to be now, and dragging one life into another rarely helped either of them. At 7:43 that morning, a 9-year-old boy named Marcus Teller arrived through the ambulance bay on a gurney, his father running alongside with his hand pressed over his mouth like he was trying to hold himself together. The paramedic giving handoff was efficient and clear. Temperature 104.8, blood pressure dropping, abdomen rigid on palpation. History of abdominal pain that had been escalating for 48 hours before it crossed the threshold into something unmistakably serious. The boy was pale in the particular way that wasn't just fear. His eyes were open but glassy, tracking slowly, and when Nora introduced herself and put a hand briefly on his arm, he asked in a thin voice where his mom was. "We're going to get her here," Nora said, which wasn't a promise about logistics. It was something for him to hold on to. "Right now I need you to tell me where it hurts the most." He pointed somewhere below, and to the right of his navel, and his face tightened doing it. Nora got him into the last available trauma bay and had an IV started and labs ordered before Dr. Renata Souza, the trauma attending on duty, arrived 2 minutes later. Souza was compact and precise, with short hair and the slightly overworked look the trauma attendings carry as a baseline by mid-morning. She did her assessment quickly and pressed 2 fingers just below the boy's navel and watched his face go the color of old paper. "Perforated," Souza said quietly, to Nora and not to the father, though the father heard it. "I'm calling surgery," Nora said. She was already reaching for the phone. Dale Teller, Heavy-set, gray around the temples, wearing the clothes of a man who had driven through the night without stopping, gripped the side rail of the gurney with both hands. "What does that mean? What's wrong with him?" Sousa shifted to face him. "We believe his appendix has ruptured. That's a serious situation, but it's treatable. We're going to move quickly and take very good care of your son." "How quickly?" Nora was already on the phone. "Now," she said, because that was the honest answer, and there wasn't a gentler version of it. Dr. Vincent Harp, the senior trauma surgeon on call, was 3 floors up in the surgical wing when she reached him. She gave him the relevant summary in under 40 seconds. Age, temperature, blood pressure trend, presentation on palpation, Sousa's assessment. Harp asked 2 questions, got 2 answers, and said he would be downstairs in 8 minutes. That was at 7:51. Marcus Del Rey came through the emergency department doors at 8:03. Nora heard him before she saw him, which was usually how it went with Del Rey. He had the kind of voice that presumed it was already being listened to. Not exactly loud, but pitched and projected with the confidence of someone who had spent years in rooms where what he said determined what happened next. She had interacted with him fewer than 15 times in 6 years, and every exchange had left her with the same faint, specific impression. She had been assessed, categorized as a lower-level operational resource, and filed away in some internal hierarchy, where her existence mattered only in terms of what she produced for the institution. He came through the doors with 2 people behind him. One was a woman from hospital administration named Sandra Greer, who Nora recognized from budget meetings she occasionally had to sit through. The other was a man in his mid-30s wearing clothes that were expensive in the subtle way that suggested he didn't need to make them obvious. He was cradling his right forearm against his chest with his left hand and wincing with the expression of someone who was in genuine but not extreme discomfort. He was moving under his own power, walking steadily, looking around the department with the mild impatience of someone who was used to waiting rooms that did not apply to him. Del Rey went directly to the unit clerk's desk. The clerk on duty was a young man named Jordan who had been with the department for 8 months and was still learning which hospital politics were visible and which ones ran underground. "I need Dr. Harp," Del Rey said. "Immediately." Jordan looked up. "Dr. Harp has been called to surgery, sir. He's on his way down from the surgical floor right now. I can get you not a resident, not a PA. Harp." Del Rey's voice had the flat quality of someone repeating something they considered already settled. "My nephew needs to be seen by the senior surgeon." Jordan picked up the phone with the look of a man hoping someone would materialize to solve the problem for him. Nora had come out of the trauma bay on her way to the supply room when she registered the conversation. She stopped. She looked at Del Rey, then at the man he'd brought in, then back at Del Rey. She walked over. "Mr. Del Rey," she said. Her voice was even. "Dr. Harp is currently preparing to operate on a 9-year-old with a ruptured appendix. He's unavailable." Del Rey turned. He looked at her badge, her scrubs, her position at the nurse's station. He performed the rapid automatic ranking that some people did without noticing they were doing it. "Pull him out of prep," Del Rey said. "Kyle needs to be evaluated. That takes 15 minutes. 15 minutes in a perforated appendix case is the difference between a clean surgery and sepsis," Nora said. "I'm not pulling him." Something in Del Rey's expression shifted. Not rage, something quieter than that. The controlled recalibration of a person encountering an obstacle they didn't expect and weren't sure how to categorize. "Do you know who I am?" he said. "Yes," Nora said. "You're the COO. I know who you are." "Then you understand when I tell you to get me Harp, that's not a request." "It's a request I can't fulfill," she said, "because fulfilling it would harm a critically ill child who is already in that room." She paused 1 beat. "I will make sure your nephew is seen by a qualified physician the moment someone is available. If his arm is broken, we'll get imaging. If there's something more serious, I'll escalate appropriately. That's what I'm able to offer you right now." Del Rey looked at her for a moment. Around them, the department had gone slightly, subtly quieter. The kind of quiet that isn't silence, just attention. "That is not acceptable," he said. "I'm sorry. He stopped himself, breathed in through his nose. "You work for this hospital. I run this hospital. When I tell you to do something, you do it. That's how this works." "With respect," Nora said, you run the administrative operations of this hospital. In this room, clinical decisions belong to the clinical staff. That's how it has to work. Because the alternative is administrators making medical decisions, and that gets people killed. She didn't say it to humiliate him. She said it the way she said most things, matter of fact, without decoration, because she genuinely believed that clarity was more useful than softening and that the situation they were in had no room for softening anyway. Marcus Del Rey was not a man who experienced clarity as a gift. His jaw tightened. He took one step toward her, closing the distance that had been between them, and she didn't step back, which seemed to make it worse. His right hand came up, and the motion was quick and flat and entirely deliberate. And the sound of his palm connecting with the right side of her face hit the emergency department like something thrown against a wall. Open hand. Full strike. Not an accident, not a stumble, not a gesture that went wrong. A slap, clean and intentional, in front of 31 people. Nora's head moved with the impact. She absorbed it the way someone absorbs it when they've been trained to take hits without going down. Not by bracing against it, but by not fighting the movement and then bringing herself back to center. She stood exactly where she had been standing. Her left hand came up slowly, and her fingertips found the corner of her mouth where her cheek had compressed against her own teeth on the inside and drawn a thin line of blood. She looked at her fingers. She looked at Marcus Del Rey. The department was completely, absolutely still. No monitors beeped any louder, but everything else, footsteps, cartwheels, low voices, had stopped. Del Rey's face had gone through something in the 3 seconds since he'd done it. Not remorse. Something more like recalculation. A man running numbers on what he'd just done and deciding whether the answer concerned him. He turned to the 2 security officers who had been hovering near the entrance. "Escort this nurse out of the building," he said. His voice was steady. "Now." Neither of them moved immediately. Gary Mendoza, the senior of the 2, had worked the emergency department for 4 years and had handled situations ranging from intoxicated patients to genuine violence, and he was doing a very careful job of keeping his expression professional while his brain processed what he'd just watched a hospital executive do. He looked at Nora. She looked back at him. 2 minutes, she said quietly. He gave the smallest possible nod. She turned and walked back into the trauma bay without another word to Del Rey. And the silence she left behind her was the kind that made people look at their shoes. Inside, Dale Teller was still standing against the wall, watching his son with the helpless, vigilant posture of a parent who can't do anything useful and knows it. The boy's vitals on the monitor were holding. Fluids were helping, at least temporarily. Nora checked the numbers, confirmed the IV line was properly secured, added a notation to the chart. She turned to Dale. "The surgical waiting room is on the 3rd floor, north elevator," she said. "Someone will come find you as soon as there's any news. Your son is going to be in good hands." She said it plainly, without the inflection people use when they're trying to manage expectations downward. She meant it. Harp was good. The window was still open. Dale Teller nodded, unable to speak, and she didn't make him. She stepped to the far end of the bay, turned slightly away from him, and took her personal phone from her scrub's pocket. She opened her contacts and scrolled to a name she had not called in nearly 2 years. She pressed the number. It rang once. Just once. The voice that answered was low and unhurried and instantly recognizable. The voice of a man for whom being awake at any hour was simply the default condition of his life. "Voss, sir," she said. She kept her voice down, her back partly to the room. "I have a situation." A pause. 3 seconds, maybe 4. "Talk." She gave him 45 seconds. She told him the name of the hospital, the general outline of what had happened, the patient, the refusal, the strike, the suspension, and she gave him the name of the COO. She didn't editorialize. She didn't ask for anything specific. She reported the facts the way she had been trained to report facts, which was to say completely and without the parts that were just feelings. When she finished, there was a silence just long enough to mean he was thinking, not absent. Rear Admiral James Colt said 4 words. "I'm on my way." The call ended. Nora put the phone in her pocket and stood still for 1 moment. Then she walked back out. Gary Mendoza was waiting near the bay entrance the way a decent person waits, not blocking, not rushing. She handed him her department badge and her key card without being asked. He took them and didn't say anything. She went to her locker and collected her jacket, her bag, her keys. She came back through the department one final time and stopped at the nurse's station. Diane Parrish, a senior nurse who had been with Hargrove for 11 years, was standing at the counter pretending to review a chart. "Diane," Nora said. Diane looked up. "I need to give you handoff." Nora went through it patient by patient. Every pending lab, every outstanding order, every flag that needed watching. The woman in Bay 3 with limited English who was waiting on a cardiology consult and would not ask for help because she didn't know how. The man near the vending machines with the wrist fracture who had been waiting long enough that someone should check his pain level. She went through it in order, calmly, completely, the way she would have on any normal shift handoff. Diane wrote all of it down. When Nora finished, Diane looked up and something moved across her face. "Nora," she said. "Yeah. Are you okay?" Nora touched the corner of her mouth. The bleeding had stopped. "I'm fine. Don't let Bay 3 sit more than 20 minutes without a check-in." She walked out through the main doors of the emergency department, past the rows of waiting patients who had witnessed nothing and sensed everything, past the vending machines, through the sliding glass doors, and into the gray, cool air of a late October morning. She sat in her car in the parking structure for a while and did not move. Her face ached in the specific, unglamorous way that things ache when they've been hit. Not sharp anymore, just present and insistent. She pressed her palm flat against her cheek and held it there and stared at the concrete wall in front of the hood of her car. She wasn't thinking about Del Rey. She was thinking about the boy, about whether the surgery would open cleanly, about whether the perforation had been contained enough, about whether Dale Teller had gotten through to his wife yet. She was thinking about the woman in Bay 3 and whether Diane would remember the 20-minute check-in or whether it would slip in the chaos of the understaffed morning. She was also thinking, with the separate, cooler part of her mind that had been trained over 11 years to run parallel to emotion rather than through it, about what was going to happen next. Not what she wanted. What was going to happen, which was a different thing entirely, and understanding the difference between those two things was one of the few lessons from her Navy years she applied every single day. Her phone buzzed. An unsaved number she recognized immediately. A text, brief and formatted the way military communication tends to be even in a personal text. ETA 0600 tomorrow. Stay clear of the building until I arrive. She read it twice. She set the phone in the cup holder and started her car. Inside Hargrove Medical Center, Dr. Vincent Harp took Marcus Teller into the operating room at 8:31 and spent the next 2 hours and 9 minutes removing a ruptured appendix that had been perhaps 5 or 6 hours from triggering systemic infection that would have been significantly harder to reverse. The surgery went well, not perfectly, because surgeries rarely go perfectly. There were 2 moments where Harp's jaw tightened in a way his scrub nurse had learned to read over 6 years. But well. The boy was moved to pediatric recovery at 10:47. His color had improved before they even finished closing. Dale Teller was in the 3rd floor waiting room when Harpy came out in his surgical cap with his mask pulled down, and the expression on the father's face when the surgeon said, "He's going to be fine," was the kind of thing that didn't need to be described in detail. It just needed to have happened. In the administrative wing, Marcus Del Rey spent the morning differently. He had his assistant pull the paperwork for an emergency suspension before 9 a.m. He signed it and had it delivered to HR. He drafted a brief memo to department heads explaining that a nurse had been removed from duty due to insubordination and failure to comply with administrative directives. He did not include specifics in the memo. He called his brother to tell him the situation had been managed, and he called the hospital's chief legal counsel to give him a heads up that there might be some minor friction around the incident. Legal asked if there were witnesses. Del Rey said yes, but they were all hospital employees. He did not mention the cameras. He had not thought about the cameras. 4 of them, positioned at different angles throughout the emergency department, running continuously since before 7 a.m., each one capturing a clean and unambiguous visual record of everything that had occurred. He had simply forgotten they existed, which was the kind of thing that happened when a person had spent years operating in an environment where their decisions were rarely reviewed and almost never challenged. He had a lunch meeting with a potential donor. He ate well. He came back to his office, handled 2 more hours of correspondence, and left the building at 6:20. He felt, on balance, that the situation had been handled. He slept. He woke at 5:17 a.m. to 4 missed calls from the chief of hospital security, 2 texts from the board chairwoman marked urgent, and a news notification from a regional television station that had obtained security footage from an area hospital emergency department. The headline read, Hargrove Medical COO caught on camera striking on-duty nurse. Victim identified as decorated Navy veteran. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark and read it 3 times. He called his legal counsel. The phone rang and went to voicemail. He called again. Same result. He sat there holding the phone in both hands and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific and unpleasant sensation of a situation he did not know how to contain. His wife appeared in the doorway and asked why he looked like that. He had no useful answer. 49 miles northeast of Delray's bedroom, at a small regional airfield where the runway lights were still on against the pre-dawn dark, a military transport helicopter sat on the tarmac with its rotors beginning to move. Inside, Rear Admiral James Colt sat with his forearms resting on his knees and his eyes focused on the middle distance. He was 54. He had the build of a man who had spent 30 years making consequential decisions and the posture of someone who had never once confused rank with righteousness. Beside him sat his aide, a Navy officer with a document case across his lap, and a woman from the Federal Inspector General's office who had landed in the city the previous evening on a flight she had booked within 20 minutes of receiving a phone call. The aide checked his tablet. "Wheels up in 4 minutes, sir." Colt nodded once. He was not visibly angry. He had a way of looking before an operation. Still, focused, stripped of anything that wasn't relevant to what came next. And that was how he looked now. He had last seen Nora Voss at a debrief on a naval installation in the Pacific, where she had received a commendation for actions that were classified at a level that meant fewer than 40 people would ever know the full details. She had asked them not to photograph the ceremony. He had thought at the time that it was the most completely her thing she could have done, and he had been right. She had called him from the floor of an emergency room with blood in her mouth and given him the facts in 45 seconds and not asked for a single specific thing. He was not angry, he was certain. The helicopter lifted off the tarmac and banked northeast, toward the city, toward the hospital, toward a man who had made a mistake he didn't yet understand the full dimensions of. The rotors cut through the dark air. Below, the city was still mostly asleep. That was about to change. The rotors cut through the dark air, and below, the city was still mostly asleep. That was about to change. The helicopter crossed the county line at 6:09, and by the time it began its descent toward the open lot behind Hargrove Medical Center's north parking structure, the sky had shifted from black to the particular shade of gray-blue that comes in the 20 minutes before actual sunrise. Not light yet, just the absence of full dark. A maintenance worker named Paul, who was doing his 7 a.m. perimeter check, heard it first. A sound that didn't belong to the morning, low and rhythmic and growing, and he looked up from his clipboard and shielded his eyes against nothing because there wasn't enough light yet to need shielding, and he watched the helicopter come down with the controlled, deliberate precision of military flight and settle onto the asphalt of the maintenance lot with a thump that he felt in his chest. He stood there holding his clipboard for a moment. Then he took out his phone and called his supervisor, not because there was a protocol for this, but because there should have been. Inside the hospital, the morning shift had been running for 40 minutes under conditions that were already tense before the helicopter arrived. The footage from the previous day's security cameras had been obtained. Nobody in administration had been able to determine yet how, though the leading theory involved a unit clerk who had a cousin at a local TV station, and it had aired on 3 regional channels during the 11 o'clock news the night before and again at 5 a.m., which meant that by the time the day shift walked through the doors, most of them had already seen it. The ones who hadn't seen it had been told about it in the parking lot, or in the elevator, or in whispered exchanges at the coffee station in the break room before they clocked in. The video was clear. The camera angle was unambiguous. There was no version of it that could be interpreted differently. Diane Parrish had seen it at 10:15 the previous night, sitting on her couch with her phone in both hands, and she had watched it twice and then set the phone face down on the cushion beside her and sat very still for a while. She had worked in emergency medicine for 11 years. She had seen difficult things that required a certain kind of deliberate compartmentalization to process and keep processing, and she was not a person who was easily rattled. But watching the footage, watching Nora stand there, watching the motion, watching her head turn and then come back, watching her touch her mouth, had rattled her in a way she wasn't able to immediately explain. It wasn't just the violence, though that was part of it. It was the stillness afterward. The way Nora had stood there, returned to herself, and kept working. As if she had simply absorbed what happened and filed it and moved forward, which was either the most impressive thing Diane had ever seen or the saddest, and she wasn't sure which. She was in the department by 6:40 with coffee she hadn't finished, and a mood she was keeping carefully professional. Most of the staff was the same, present, functional, and sitting on something. The sound of the helicopter reached the emergency department as a vibration first, a low resonance that came through the walls and the floor before it came through the air. Someone near the window said, "What is that?" And someone else said, "Helicopter." And then everyone who wasn't actively with a patient moved toward the windows and watched the military transport settle onto the maintenance lot with its lights still blinking in the pre-dawn gray. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Dr. Souza, who had come in early and was on her second coffee, said quietly, "That's not a medical transport." She was correct. The doors of the helicopter opened and 4 people stepped out. 3 of them were in military dress uniform. Navy was the consensus among the staff watching from the windows, though not everyone was certain. And 1 was in civilian clothes, a woman in a dark blazer moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who had places to be and no interest in the scenery. The man at the front of the group was tall and deliberate in his movement, the kind of person who didn't walk faster when he was in a hurry. He just walked with more intention, and the dress uniform he wore had the kind of insignia on it that people who didn't know the military didn't recognize but could feel the weight of anyway. Gary Mendoza, who had come in early as well. He had not slept particularly well, which happened sometimes after shifts where things went badly sideways, watched from just inside the ambulance bay doors and felt something settle in his stomach that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite dread. It was the particular feeling of knowing that something was coming that was much larger than the thing you'd been dealing with, and not being sure yet whether larger meant better. In the administrative wing, Marcus Del Rey was already there. He had arrived at the hospital at 6:30, which was 40 minutes earlier than his normal start time, and he had done it because his legal counsel had finally called him back at 5:45 and told him in careful, measured terms that the situation had developed overnight in ways that were going to require his physical presence. He was in his office with the door closed and his legal counsel on speaker and a cup of coffee going cold on his desk. And his counsel, a careful man named Arthur Grimes, who had been with the hospital system for 12 years, was walking him through the exposure. "The footage is the primary problem," Grimes said. "There's no factual dispute about what occurred. The question is going to be about characterization and I've already spoken to HR about the nurse's history," Del Rey said. "There are performance concerns on record that—" "Marcus," Grimes paused. "The nurse has been identified by name. The television station ran a bio piece alongside the footage at 5 a.m. Former Navy lieutenant commander, 11 years of service, 2 combat deployments, decorated for actions in the Pacific." Another pause. "They ran a photo. The caption said the nurse Marcus Del Rey struck on camera." Del Rey was quiet. "That's the framing," Grimes said. "That's what we're working inside of now." "It's one incident," Del Rey said, though he heard how it sounded as he said it. "It's one incident that was recorded from 2 angles in a public healthcare facility and aired on regional news to an audience that has now shared it approximately 40,000 times since 11 p.m. Grimes's voice was not unkind, but it was not gentle either. "I need you to not speak to anyone from any media outlet. I need you to not speak to any staff member below VP level without me on the line. And I need you to prepare for the possibility that the board is going to want to meet today. Today is Wednesday." "I'm aware." Del Rey picked up his coffee, found it cold, put it back down. "What does prepare for the possibility mean, Arthur?" There was a pause that lasted long enough to be its own answer. "It means be in the building," Grimes said. On the other side of the city, Nora Voss was awake, had been awake since 4:30, which was not unusual for her. She had never been a person who slept well past 5 regardless of what the day before had held. She was sitting at the kitchen table in her apartment with a mug of coffee and her laptop open. and she was reading the news coverage with the careful, unemotional attention she brought to things she needed to understand rather than things she wanted to feel. The coverage was extensive for a regional story. The footage had been shared widely. The biopiece the television station had run was accurate on the factual details. She had not spoken to them. She didn't know where they'd gotten the information, and she noted clinically that whoever had pulled her service record had gotten it mostly right, which meant they had access to the public portions through a FOIA request, or a source inside the VA. There were quotes from unnamed hospital staff saying things like, "This doesn't surprise me," and she was always the most professional person in that department, which she found mildly uncomfortable to read, but understood was part of the shape of how this kind of story moved. Her phone had been active since 6 a.m. Text messages from Diane, from two other colleagues, from her sister in Portland who had seen the coverage, and whose texts contained 3 questions and 7 exclamation points in a ratio that told Nora she was going to need to make a phone call at some point today. There was a voicemail from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a reporter, which she deleted. There was a text from the JAG officer who had been on the helicopter. She recognized the number from a previous communication, giving her a timeline and a meeting point. She replied with, "Confirmed, I'll be there." She closed her laptop, finished her coffee, and went to change her clothes. She chose not to wear her old uniform because she was not active duty, and wearing it would have been wrong in a way that mattered to her. She dressed in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a plain gray top, and she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment and noticed the bruising that had come up overnight on her right cheekbone, yellowish at the edges and darker toward the center, the kind of bruise that takes a day to fully surface. She touched it lightly with 2 fingers. It was tender but not severe. She picked up her keys and left. The drive to the hospital took 22 minutes. She parked in the main lot and sat in the car for a moment, not because she was hesitating, but because she was organizing, running through the sequence of what was likely to happen and identifying the points where she would need to be precise and the points where she could let other people manage the room. Then she got out and walked toward the main entrance. She was intercepted before she reached the doors, not by security, which was what she'd half expected, by Diane, who was waiting outside in her scrubs with her arms crossed and an expression that landed somewhere between relief and barely managed distress. "You didn't have to come in," Diane said. "I'm not here for a shift," Nora said. Diane looked at the bruise on her face, clearly trying not to make it the first thing she'd mentioned, and having mentioned other things first, now unable to not say it. "Nora, it looks worse than it is," Nora said, which was true in the sense that bruises always look worse than what's happening underneath, and less true in the sense that she was still being reminded of it every time she chewed. "There's a helicopter in the maintenance lot," Diane said. "I know. People are saying military, Navy." Diane studied her. "You knew this was going to happen." Nora didn't answer that directly, which was an answer. "Is Delray in the building?" "He came in at 6:30. He's in his office with his lawyer on the phone. Administration has been sending emails since 5 a.m. trying to get ahead of it." Diane exhaled. "The emails are very carefully worded." "They usually are," Nora said. She went inside. The lobby had more people in it than a Wednesday morning typically warranted. Some were staff who should have been in their departments. Some were administrative personnel who had found reasons to be near the windows on the ground floor. The energy in the building had the specific texture of an institution that knew something significant was about to happen and was collectively pretending to go about its business while angling to see it. Nora crossed the lobby and went to the small conference room on the east side of the ground floor, where the JAG officer, Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Farrow, who she'd met twice before under completely different circumstances, was already set up with a laptop and a document case and a cup of coffee she appeared to actually need. Farrow stood when Nora came in. She looked at the bruise first, the way everyone was going to look at it today, then met her eyes. "Commander Voss," she said, using the rank that was both technically outdated and also, in the current context, precise in the way that civilian titles weren't. "Lieutenant Commander Farrow," Nora said. "Is the Admiral here?" "He landed 20 minutes ago. He's currently in a conversation with the hospital board chairwoman." Farrow's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. She didn't know he was coming. She's been updated. The board chairwoman was a woman named Margaret Osei, who had been on the Hargrove board for 9 years and who had, by most accounts, run it with the kind of steady pragmatism that kept institutions functional without making them great. She had received the first call about the footage from a board member at 11:30 the previous night and had spent the hours between then and now doing what board chairs do in crises, calling lawyers, reviewing liability, assessing the gap between what the public record showed and what the institution's interests were. She had arrived at the hospital at 6 a.m. She had not expected to find a rear admiral in her conference room. Colt had been there when she arrived, which was by design. He was seated at the table with his aide and the woman from the Inspector General's office, and when Osei walked in, she stopped in the doorway for a full 3 seconds before she came in and sat down. "Admiral," she said. "Ms. Osei," he said. "Thank you for making time." "I wasn't aware I had a choice," she said, which was direct enough that it earned a small measure of his respect. "You always have a choice," he said. "This one is just fairly clear." He had spent the first 20 minutes giving her the parts of the picture she didn't have, not Nora's classified service record, that stayed classified, but the relevant framework. That the nurse her COO had struck on camera was a decorated combat medical officer who had served 2 deployments in high-risk operational environments, that her actions in those environments had been recognized at the highest levels of the naval chain of command, and that the admiral personally had a direct and significant reason to be invested in her welfare and in the accountability of anyone who harmed her. Osei had listened without interrupting, which was the quality he'd appreciated most in a board chair. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The board is meeting at 9 a.m., she said. "I had planned to address Mr. Delray's suspension at that meeting." "Suspension," Colt said. "Pending investigation." "Ms. Osei," he leaned forward slightly. "I have a federal investigator in this building and a JAG officer reviewing the footage, the response, and the employment records of everyone whose decisions contributed to what happened in that emergency department yesterday. A suspension pending investigation is an institutional process that will take weeks and will conclude with findings that are shaped by institutional interest." He paused. "That is not what I'm here for." Osei met his eyes. She was 61, had run organizations through difficult moments before, and was not a woman who intimidated easily. But she was also, in this specific moment, very aware of what sat across the table from her. Not just rank, but weight, the kind that came from being in rooms where the consequences were real and the margin for error was zero. "What are you here for?" she said. "Accountability," Colt said. "Fast and public." While that conversation was happening on the 3rd floor, Marcus Delray was on his 4th call of the morning and was beginning to understand, in the incremental and deeply unpleasant way that people understand things they've been avoiding, that the shape of his situation had changed significantly overnight. His legal counsel had been careful in the language he used, but the content was clear enough. The footage had moved beyond local news. 3 national outlets had picked it up, and the nurse he had struck had a service record that the public was finding, in the specific way that the public found things when they were motivated by outrage, which was to say quickly and thoroughly. He had asked Grimes twice about the possibility of a settlement. Grimes had said both times that they needed to assess the landscape before discussing options. Delray understood that this was lawyer for the landscape is not good. His assistant knocked on the door at 8:05 and told him that the board chairwoman needed him on the 3rd floor. He straightened his tie, which he'd been adjusting compulsively for the last 20 minutes, and told her he'd be there in 5. He used the 5 minutes to call his brother, who was a real estate attorney in another state, and who had approximately no relevant expertise, but who was the person Delray called when things felt like they were moving faster than he could track. His brother said, "Just don't say anything you don't have to say." Delray said, "Right." He rode the elevator to the 3rd floor. He came around the corner of the corridor and saw the door to the main conference room, which had the particular quality of a closed door that people knew things were happening behind. And he saw his assistant's face when she looked up from the small desk outside it, and he understood from her expression alone that 5 minutes had been the wrong interval. He opened the door. He saw the conference table. He saw Margaret Osei at the head of it. He saw Arthur Grimes, who had apparently arrived at the hospital without telling Delray he was coming, which Delray filed as significant. He saw 2 people in Navy dress uniform he didn't recognize. And then he saw the man at Osei's right, who was looking at him with the calm, complete, assessing attention of someone who had already formed his conclusions and was simply completing the formality of direct observation. The insignia on the uniform registered half a second after the face. Rear Admiral. Del Rey's hand was still on the door handle. "Mr. Del Rey," Margaret Osei said, "please sit down." The meeting lasted 41 minutes. Del Rey would later remember it in fragments. Questions asked in the flat, professional tone of people who were not asking because they didn't know the answers. The quiet sound of the JAG officer's pen on paper. The way Grimes kept his expression completely neutral in a manner that was its own kind of verdict. Osei's face, when the Inspector General's representative put a series of documents on the table and asked Del Rey to explain the procurement records from fiscal year 2021 through 2024. That was the part he hadn't anticipated. He had been prepared, or had told himself he was prepared, for the footage, for the questions about yesterday, for the conversation about conduct and consequence. He had a response built for that, a series of talking points Grimes had helped him construct around professional judgment and institutional authority and the stress of leadership decisions. He was not prepared for the procurement records. The woman from the Inspector General's office, her name was Diane Park, not a name he'd heard before, not connected to anyone he knew, placed a packet of financial documents on the table with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times and found it neither satisfying nor difficult, simply necessary. She explained in approximately 4 sentences that her office had been in receipt of an anonymous disclosure regarding financial irregularities in Hargrove Medical Center's Administrative Procurement Division for the past 8 months, and that the events of the previous day had provided sufficient cause to move from preliminary review to formal investigation. The room was quiet. "I don't," Del Rey started. "Mr. Del Rey," Grimes said, quietly but with a specific firmness, "I'd recommend you let me speak." Del Rey closed his mouth. The procurement records were detailed. They showed a pattern, not a single instance, not a gray area, but a pattern across 3 fiscal years of vendor contracts awarded to companies with indirect financial connections to entities in which Del Rey or members of his extended family held interests. The numbers were not small. The documentation was not thin. Park laid it out with the methodical, unhurried thoroughness of someone who had spent 8 months building a structure she was confident in. Del Rey looked at the documents and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific vertigo of standing in a version of his life that was not the one he had been inhabiting 5 minutes earlier. He had walked into this room thinking it was about a nurse. He was beginning to understand it was about everything. On the ground floor, in the small conference room where Nora was sitting across from Rebecca Farrow, with a second cup of coffee she'd gotten from the vending machine in the hallway, her phone buzzed with a text from an unsaved number she recognized as the Admiral's aide. "Board meeting moved to 9. You're requested to be present." She looked at the time, 8:47. "I've been asked to the board meeting," she said to Farrow. Farrow looked up from her laptop. "I know. The Admiral requested you specifically." She paused. "Are you okay with that?" Nora considered the question. Not the surface of it, the room, the meeting, the institutional formality, but the real question underneath it, which was whether she was okay with being the visible center of something that had grown significantly beyond the confines of yesterday's emergency department. "I'm okay with it," she said. "You don't have to present anything," Farrow said. "You don't have to speak if you don't want to. The Admiral will handle the substance." "I know," Nora said. "I'm still okay with it." She stood, straightened her jacket, and picked up her coffee. The elevator to the 3rd floor was occupied when she reached it. A group of board members arriving early, suits and briefcases, and the low, tense murmur of people comparing notes before a meeting they hadn't been fully briefed on. Nora took the stairs. She came out of the stairwell on the 3rd floor at 8:53 and nearly walked into Gary Mendoza, who was standing in the corridor outside the conference room with his hands clasped in front of him and an expression that combined professional neutrality with something much more human. "Voss," he said. "Gary." He looked at her face. He didn't say anything about the bruise. He'd been there when it happened, had a better view than most, and she appreciated that he seemed to understand that acknowledging it again wasn't going to serve either of them. "You look calm," he said. "I'm calm," she said, which was true in the factual sense and partially misleading in the human sense, because calm was not the same as fine, and she was not pretending to be fine. "There are 2 more vehicles in the lot," he said quietly. "Federal plates. They came in about 20 minutes ago." She absorbed that. "Okay." "Okay?" he repeated, as if testing the word to see if it held. "Yeah," she said. She went to the conference room door. She knocked once, and when it opened from the inside, she walked in. The room was fuller than she'd expected. Margaret Osei at the head of the table, 5 board members distributed along both sides, Arthur Grimes in the corner with his document case, Diane Park with her procurement files still arranged in front of her, the JAG officer at a side table, the Admiral's aide standing near the window, and at Osei's right, Rear Admiral James Colt, who turned when the door opened and looked at Nora Voss with an expression that was, by his standards, openly warm, which for him meant the particular quality of attention that a person gives someone they respect and are relieved to see standing. He stood up. The room registered this. When an admiral stands up, people notice. It's not a dramatic gesture. It's a simple movement, a person rising from a chair, but it carries the weight of what it represents, which is a deliberate public choice about where respect is owed and who is owed it. "Nora," he said. "Sir," she said. He crossed the room and extended his hand, and she shook it, and he kept her hand in both of his for a moment, the way people do when they mean something by it and don't need to say what it is out loud. The board members were watching this. Marcus Del Rey, who was seated halfway down the table and had gone through the last 41 minutes in a state of managed, contained shock, was watching it too. He was watching a rear admiral greet a woman he had struck with the warmth of someone receiving a colleague they'd served beside, and he was processing, with the slow and crushing inevitability of a building settling after its foundation has been compromised, what that meant for every argument he had been building in his head since 5:17 that morning. Margaret Osei waited until Nora was seated before she began. "The board has reviewed the footage," she said. "The board has been briefed by Admiral Colt's office regarding the circumstances and has received a preliminary summary from the Federal Inspector General's office regarding a separate matter." She looked around the table. "Given the weight of what's in front of us this morning, I'd like to address both." She was methodical, Osei. She moved through the items in the order that made structural sense. First, the events of the previous day, the footage, the staff accounts, the medical record confirming that a critically ill child had been appropriately prioritized. Then the question of conduct. Then the procurement matter, which she addressed with the careful language of a board chair who understood that this was now a federal matter and chose her words accordingly. Del Rey's legal counsel interjected twice. Both times, Osei acknowledged him and continued. At 9:47 a.m., the board voted. Del Rey watched them do it. He watched 7 people cast votes on a matter that had been, 24 hours ago, entirely within the horizon of his control. And he watched the count come in, and the number was 7-0. And the motion was for immediate termination of his employment pending the completion of the federal investigation, with forfeiture of the severance provisions in his contract due to conduct violations. Osei announced the result. The room was quiet. Del Rey looked across the table at Nora Voss, who was looking back at him with an expression that was not satisfaction and was not triumph. It was the look of someone who was present and paying attention and not pretending to feel things she didn't feel. There was no gloating in it. There was no warmth either. There was just a person meeting his gaze and not looking away, which in the circumstances was more than enough. He looked at the table. Outside the conference room, in the corridor where morning light was coming through the windows at the far end, 2 men in plain suits who had arrived in one of the federal vehicles Gary Mendoza had noted were standing with the particular posture of people who were waiting for something specific. They had been there for 11 minutes. Inside the room, Arthur Grimes leaned over to Del Rey and said very quietly, "Don't say anything." Del Rey nodded. He was still nodding when the conference room door opened and the 2 men in suits came in, and the taller one said his name, and the shorter one held up a credential that Del Rey recognized, and the words that followed, a federal arrest warrant, charges to be formally presented, the right to remain silent, came at him in pieces that he was aware of intellectually, but that his brain was refusing to assemble into a complete picture. He stood when they asked him to stand. He put his hands where they asked him to put them. He walked out of the conference room between 2 federal agents, past the board members who were not quite looking at him, past his legal counsel who had risen from his chair and was already on his phone, past Gary Mendoza in the corridor who stood absolutely still and watched it happen, past Nora Voss, who had come out of the conference room behind the group and was standing near the doorway. Del Rey looked at her as he passed. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed to be said in the corridor of the third floor of Hargrove Medical Center on a Wednesday morning in October, with federal agents on either side of him and a hallway of hospital staff who had found various reasons to be on this floor at this particular hour, watching in a silence that had its own weight. He kept walking. The elevator doors closed. In the conference room, the board members were still at the table. Margaret Osei was speaking to the Admiral's aide about documentation. The Inspector General's representative was gathering her files. The JAG officer was on his laptop. Nora was standing in the doorway with her hand on the frame and her coffee from the vending machine gone cold at her side, and she was looking down the now empty corridor, and her expression was one that was hard to name precisely. Not relief, not yet. That came later, if it came at all, and it came in smaller pieces than people expected and mixed with things that complicated it. Not triumph. Something closer to the feeling that comes when a situation has reached the point it was always going to reach, and you are still standing, and the thing you were holding has been laid down, and the hallway in front of you is empty and quiet and yours. She stood there for a moment. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she didn't recognize, area code she didn't immediately place. It read, "This is Dale Teller, Marcus's dad. Someone gave me your name. I wanted you to know he woke up an hour ago and asked if the nurse who was there in the morning was okay. I didn't know what to tell him. I hope you are." She read it twice. She typed back, "Tell him I'm okay. Tell him I'm glad he's awake." She put the phone in her pocket. Down the hall, the elevator indicator above the doors showed the car descending. 3211, lobby. And then below, somewhere on the ground floor, the morning continued. Down the hall, the elevator indicator above the doors showed the car descending. 321, lobby. And then below, somewhere on the ground floor, the morning continued with Marcus Del Rey in it, moving toward a world that looked nothing like the one he'd woken up in. Nora stayed in the doorway for another few seconds. Then she went back into the conference room because there was still work to do, and standing in corridors watching elevators wasn't going to help anyone. Margaret Osei was on her phone at the head of the table, speaking in the low, controlled voice of a person managing an institutional crisis in real time. The board members had thinned. 2 had left to handle their own calls. 1 was speaking quietly with the JAG officer in the corner, and the remaining 2 were doing the thing people do in high-pressure rooms when the main event is over, which is performing a kind of deliberate normalcy while their minds are still catching up. Diane Park from the Inspector General's office had packed her files into a document case with the brisk efficiency of someone who had another 3 appointments after this one and was already mentally in the next one. Admiral Colt was standing near the window with his aide, speaking quietly. He looked up when Nora came back in. "Sit down," he said, not as an order, but as the kind of thing you say to someone you're concerned about when you're not sure how to ask the more direct version of that. She sat. He came over and took the chair across from her, not the Admiral's chair, not the head of the table, just a chair, and leaned forward with his forearms on the table. "How are you actually doing?" he said. "I'm processing," she said. "That's not an answer." "It's the most accurate one I have right now." He looked at her face. The bruise had deepened since the morning, the way bruises do when they've had a few hours to commit, and the discoloration ran from the high point of her cheekbone down toward her jaw in the particular ugly gradient of a direct impact strike. He had seen worse. That didn't make this easier to look at. "The federal charges are going to take time," he said. "The procurement case is solid. Park's office has been building it for 8 months, and they had enough before yesterday. Yesterday just accelerated the timeline." He paused. "The assault charge is straightforward. There are 31 witnesses and 2 camera angles." "I know," she said. You'll need to give a formal statement. Farrow will handle that process." "Okay." He was quiet for a moment. He had known Nora Voss for 9 years, had served operationally adjacent to her for 2 of them, and he had learned in that time that she processed things in layers. The surface layer was functional almost immediately, because she had trained herself to keep moving regardless of what had happened. But the deeper layers took longer and sometimes surfaced in ways she didn't entirely expect. He had watched her, in the hours after an operation in the Pacific that had cost them 2 people, complete her medical reports, brief the recovery team, and eat dinner before she'd gone to her bunk and stayed there for 14 hours. He was not worried about her surface layer. "Is there anyone you need to call?" he said. She thought about her sister in Portland, whose text was still unanswered. "Yes." "Then do that." "After the statement." He almost smiled. "After the statement," he agreed. What neither of them knew yet, and what was already moving through the hospital's informal network with the speed that hospitals move information when the information is significant, was that the story had not stopped developing when Del Rey left the building. It had in fact been developing in a direction that nobody in the conference room had anticipated. It started with a man named Roger Stills. Stills was 63, a cardiologist who had been on staff at Hargrove for 18 years, and who had, as Diane Park's procurement files showed in the 3rd section of the documentation she'd laid on the board table that morning, been peripherally aware of the vendor irregularities for approximately 2 years. He had not reported them. He had not participated in them directly, but he had been present in meetings where decisions were made, and his signature appeared on 2 internal budget approvals that connected through a chain that was not simple but was traceable to the same vendor network that was central to the federal investigation. Stills had been in his office on the 4th floor when the federal agents walked Del Rey through the lobby. He had watched from his window. He had then spent 11 minutes sitting at his desk before he picked up his phone and called his personal attorney. His personal attorney had told him, in terms that were not ambiguous, that the window for voluntary cooperation with the Inspector General's office was narrow and closing, and that being proactive was categorically better than being reactive, and that he needed to decide in the next hour what kind of participant in this process he intended to be. Stills had made his decision. He called Diane Park's office directly. He got her assistant, left his name and number, and was called back within 6 minutes. The conversation that followed was brief and resulted in a meeting scheduled for 2 p.m. in a room on the 4th floor that Park requested be kept quiet. It was not kept quiet. It was never going to be kept quiet. By 11 a.m., the story had moved beyond the regional news cycle. A national outlet had run the security footage alongside a profile piece on Nora Voss that sourced her service record, 2 interviews with former Navy colleagues speaking on background, and a statement from a veterans advocacy group that was measured in its language and devastating in its substance. A second national outlet had picked up the procurement angle from a leak that Park's office was already trying to trace. The Hargrove Medical Center communications team, which was a department of 4 people who had been hired to manage donor newsletters and press releases about new equipment, had fielded 37 media inquiries before noon and was responding to none of them. Nora gave her formal statement to Rebecca Farrow in the small conference room on the ground floor at 10:15. She was precise and thorough and took no shortcuts, and Farrow asked her questions that were clear and well-structured, and the whole thing took 47 minutes and was recorded and documented and would later become part of a federal record. When it was done, Nora asked if she could have a copy. Farrow said yes. "What happens to the hospital?" Nora asked. "That's above my pay grade," Farrow said, which was honest and not evasive. "The board is in an emergency session. My understanding is they're considering interim leadership options." "And the staff?" Farrow looked at her. "The staff keeps working. That's what hospitals do." Nora knew that. She just wanted to hear someone say it. She went outside after the statement. The day had warmed slightly from the gray morning. It was pushing 50 degrees now, thin October sunlight making its best effort, and she sat on a bench near the main entrance that was technically for patients waiting on rides and was currently unoccupied. She called her sister. Her sister answered on the second ring with, "Oh, thank God," which was the kind of thing that bypassed several layers of composure at once. "I'm fine," Nora said. Nora, I saw your face. I know, I'm fine. The situation is resolved." "Resolved how?" "That word doesn't mean what you think it means. He hit you in front of... There were so many people. He's been arrested," Nora said. "It's a federal matter now. I can't say a lot more than that." Her sister was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, still worried, but coming from a different angle. "Are you actually okay? Not the situation." You. Nora looked at the parking lot. A woman was helping an older man from a car to a wheelchair, moving slowly, with the patience of long practice. I'm working on it, she said. That's the truthful answer. Do you need me to come? No, but I'll call you tonight. Promise me. I promise. She sat on the bench for a few more minutes after the call. The bruise ached with the steady, low-grade persistence of the second day, which was always worse than the first. She pressed her fingers against her cheekbone gently, feeling the warmth of the inflammation, and thought about nothing specific for a little while, which was its own kind of rest. Then her phone buzzed again, and the rest was over. It was a text from Diane Parrish. You need to come back inside. Something's happening in the ER. She stood up. She went back in through the main doors, took the corridor to the left, and pushed through the double doors into the emergency department. The department was running the way it always ran. Controlled, busy, perpetually on the edge of its capacity. But there was a layer of something else underneath it, a kind of taut alertness that she clocked within 2 seconds of walking in. Diane was at the nurse's station. She looked up when Nora came through. What happened? Nora said. Multi-vehicle accident on Route 9 about 40 minutes ago, Diane said. 5 patients incoming. 3 already here. We've got a problem with 2 of them. She pulled up something on the screen in front of her and turned it so Nora could see. Interim attending is Dr. Ramos. He came in at 7, and he's been managing fine, but... She stopped. But what? One of the incoming is a 7-year-old. Blunt chest trauma, tension pneumothorax developing in transit. Paramedics are on the radio right now. Nora was already moving toward the supply bay. Where's Sousa? Off today. Ramos called her at home, but she's 40 minutes out. Harp? In surgery. Has been since 8. Who else is surgical? Dr. Yi is on the 4th floor. I'm trying to reach him. Nora found a spare set of scrubs in the supply room. The department kept extras for situations like this, which were not uncommon, and changed in 30 seconds, which was not a record, but was close. She came back out and found Ramos, a solid 38-year-old emergency physician who was competent and knew exactly where the edges of his competence were, which was one of the more valuable qualities a doctor in his position could have. Boss, he said, you're suspended. My suspension is under review pending the board's emergency session, she said. Is that going to be a problem right now? He looked at her for 1 second. No, he said. The kid is going to be your problem. Radio says she's deteriorating. The ambulance came in at 11:32. The girl, 7 years old, 50 pounds, name was Sophie Brandt, had been in the back seat of her mother's car when a pickup truck ran a red light on Route 9 and hit them on the passenger side. The paramedic team had been managing her airway since they'd loaded her, and the lead medic, a woman named Torres, who Nora had worked with many times, gave handoff with the clipped precision of someone who knew time was the variable they didn't have. 7-year-old female, passenger side impact, loss of consciousness at scene recovered en route, GCS now 13, tracheal deviation, decreased breath sounds right side, BP 84/50 and falling, SATs dropping. We've got a needle in, but it's not holding. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the chest cavity outside the lung, building pressure, pushing the heart, and remaining functional lung out of position. In a 7-year-old, the margins were smaller, and the deterioration was faster, and the interventions that worked in adults had to be recalibrated for a chest the size of both of a grown person's hands placed together. Nora had seen this before. She had managed it before, in conditions that made a hospital bay look like a surgical suite. She did not allow herself to think about that. She thought about the child on the gurney and the physiology and the tools available. She needs a chest tube, she told Ramos. The needle's not sufficient. I know, he said. I've done 4. In pediatric? A beat. 2. I've done 11, she said. Not a competition. Information. Tell me how you want to handle this. He made the decision in 2 seconds, which was the right amount of time. You lead. I'm right here. The next 18 minutes were the kind that compressed and expanded simultaneously. Each individual action precise and deliberate, the sequence moving fast enough that the clock seemed unreliable. Sophie Brandt was small, and her veins were difficult, and her blood pressure had dropped to 79/40 by the time Nora had the field prepared. Dr. Yi arrived from the 4th floor at the 12-minute mark, and assessed and confirmed the course of action without needing to be briefed beyond 30 seconds of summary. The chest tube was placed, the air released. The girl's oxygen saturation, which had been at 78% and falling, began climbing. 82, 86, 90. Her blood pressure stabilized, not perfectly. Nothing in a 7-year-old with blunt chest trauma stabilizes perfectly, but in the direction of sustainable. Ramos stood back and exhaled through his nose. "Good," he said, which was the only word available. Sophie's mother was in the waiting room. She had been brought in separately, a laceration on her forehead from the airbag, which had been treated quickly because the medics had assessed her as stable while her daughter was not. She didn't know yet how her daughter was. She had been asking every 10 minutes at the desk, and the clerk had been telling her what clerks tell people in that situation, which is that someone will come and update her as soon as there's information, which is true and also the most difficult sentence to hear when you are the person waiting. Nora went to tell her. She did not make Ramos do it because Ramos had been managing 4 other patients simultaneously, and because she had been the one in the room, and because she had learned a long time ago that sending information through intermediaries when you could deliver it directly was a way of protecting yourself at the expense of the person who needed to receive the news, and she didn't believe in that. Sophie's mother, whose name was Anna Brandt, 34 years old, right eye swollen half shut from the airbag, a bandage across her forehead that was already showing a faint bloom of red at the center, stood up the moment Nora came through the waiting room door. "She's stable," Nora said. "She had a serious injury to her lung that we needed to treat urgently, and we did. She's stable now, and Dr. Yi is with her." Anna Brandt put both hands over her mouth. She sat back down, hard, the way people sit when their legs stop cooperating. She made a sound that wasn't words. Nora sat in the chair beside her. She didn't say anything else immediately, because there was nothing else that needed to be said immediately, and because sometimes the only thing to do is be present while someone processes news that they have been holding their breath for. After a minute, Anna Brandt lowered her hands. Her eyes were wet, but her voice, when it came, was steadier than it had any right to be. "Is she going to be okay? She'll need to be monitored, and she may need further evaluation, but what we saw in her numbers in the last few minutes is encouraging," Nora said. She was careful, not falsely reassuring, not overly cautious, just accurate. "She's a strong kid, and we got to her quickly. That matters." Anna nodded. "Can I see her?" "In a little while. I'll make sure someone comes to get you as soon as it's appropriate." She stood to go. "Wait," Anna said. "What's your name?" Nora told her. "Thank you," Anna said. The words were simple and direct and not decorated, and they landed the way those words land when they're completely meant. Nora went back into the department. The next 2 hours were busy in the way that hospital emergency departments are routinely, relentlessly busy, which is to say that the Sophie Brandt case was not the end of anything, just one point in a continuous line. 2 more patients from the Route 9 accident came through and were managed. A man in his 70s with a suspected M1 arrived by ambulance and went directly to cardiology. A woman in her late 20s came in on her own with a dislocated shoulder from a fall that she had been trying not to come in for, which Nora could tell from the way she kept saying she was sure it was fine and it wasn't a big deal and she didn't want to take anyone's time. "You dislocated your shoulder," Nora said, "and you drove here yourself?" "I used my other hand," the woman said. "That's impressive and not a thing you should do again," Nora said, and the woman almost laughed, which was good. Through all of it, the dislocated shoulder, the M1, the remaining follow-up from the accident, Nora was aware at some peripheral level of the larger movement happening in and around the hospital. The way the institution was adjusting itself to the new reality of the morning, the way a body adjusts to a disruption, sending resources to the affected area, redistributing, compensating. She was aware of it the way you're aware of weather. It was real, and she could feel it, but it wasn't what she was focusing on, because in the room she was in, what mattered was what was in front of her. That changed at 1:45 p.m. She was at the nurse's station updating a chart when she became aware that the department had gone fractionally quieter, not silent, just adjusted, and she looked up and saw what had caused it. Admiral Colt was standing at the entrance to the emergency department. He was still in his dress uniform. He had his hands at his sides and he was not doing anything theatrical or announced. He had simply come in and stopped and was looking for her, and the staff in the department were registering his presence with the reflexive attention that a person in full military dress uniform commands in a civilian space, particularly after a morning in which the entire hospital had been rearranged by events he'd been central to. Nora set down her pen. She crossed the department to where he was standing. "You're working," he said. "Yes. Your suspension hasn't been formally reinstated or formally ended," she said. "In the interim, there was a pediatric chest trauma with no attending trauma surgeon available. I made a call." He looked at her. "The board's interim leadership decision is going to be finalized in the next hour. Margaret Osei has asked me to be present when they address the staff." "Okay." She's also asked whether you'd be willing to be present. Nora looked back at the department, the active boards, the patients, the two nurses managing the afternoon flow. "I need 20 minutes to make sure handoffs are covered." "Take the 20 minutes," he said. She did. She gave clean, thorough handoff notes on every patient she'd been involved with that shift. She updated Ramos, who accepted the information and said carefully, "For what it's worth, I'm glad you were here." "It's worth something," she said. She went upstairs. The staff assembly that Margaret Osei had called was in the main auditorium on the second floor, which held around 200 people and was the kind of room that felt different depending on what it was being used for. On normal days, it hosted grand rounds and budget presentations and the occasional retirement party. Today, it had the quality of a room where something real was going to happen, which people could feel before they sat down. The room filled quickly. There were nurses, physicians, technicians, administrative staff, clerks, maintenance workers, the hospital's population in cross-section. Nora came in through the side door with Colt's aide and found a position along the side wall. She didn't want to be at the front, and the Admiral's aide didn't push her on it. Osei spoke first. She was direct and did not waste words, which Nora continued to respect. She addressed the events of the previous day, confirmed Del Rey's termination and arrest, confirmed that the board had appointed an interim COO from within the hospital's senior administrative team effective immediately, and confirmed that the federal investigation into procurement practices would proceed and that the hospital's cooperation with that investigation was unconditional. She said that the staff's conduct during the preceding 24 hours, maintaining patient care through a period of serious institutional disruption, had been noted and was not taken for granted. Then she stepped back. Admiral Colt came to the front of the room. He didn't have notes. He wasn't the kind of person who needed notes for what he was about to say. "Most of you don't know why I'm here," he said. "Some of you have figured it out, and some of you are going to figure it out in the next couple of minutes, and then all of you are going to understand something about the woman who works in your emergency department that I think you should have known already." The room was completely still. 200 people and the sound of the ventilation system. In 2016, I was part of an operation in the Pacific that went wrong in several significant ways, Colt said. "I won't give you the classified details because they're classified, but I'll give you the part that matters. I was in the water. My team was compromised. The situation had deteriorated to the point where my senior medical officer, the person responsible for my team's survival, had declared me unsalvageable and begun attending to other casualties. That was the correct clinical decision. I want to be clear about that. Given the information available, it was the correct decision." "Beim Maschum ans." He paused. Lieutenant Commander Nora Voss disagreed. She had already completed treatment on 2 critical casualties. She went back into the water. She reached me in conditions that I am not going to describe to you because I don't have the words for them that aren't military jargon, and she brought me back to the surface, and she kept me alive for 37 minutes in open water until extraction was possible. He looked around the room. I was told afterward that survival in those conditions for that duration was not a realistic expectation. I'm standing here, so I have some evidence to the contrary. Nobody moved. "I'm telling you this," Colt continued, "because yesterday morning the woman who did that was told she didn't matter. She was told that the authority of an administrator superseded her medical judgment, and when she held to that judgment, when she did exactly what you should want every person in your emergency department to do, which is protect the patient in front of them, regardless of who's asking them not to, she was struck across the face and escorted out of the building." He let that sit for a moment. "She made one phone call," he said. "To me. She gave me the facts. She didn't ask me to intervene. She didn't ask me for anything specific. She reported what had happened, and then she spent her remaining 2 minutes in that department finishing her handoff notes so the next shift would have what they needed. Nora was looking at the floor near the front of the room. She could feel the attention of the room, but she was not going to look at 200 faces looking at her. Not yet. Because if she did that, the composure she had been holding since 6:30 this morning was going to have a problem. "I want you to understand," Colt said, "that the conduct you witnessed in that footage, not Nora's conduct, the other conduct, is what happens when institutions allow authority to become disconnected from accountability. When the person who can sign a paycheck believes that makes their judgment more valuable than the person who can save a life." He looked around the room again, slowly. "You all work in a building where that can happen. You all have a role in whether it does." He stepped back, and then he did the thing that nobody in the room had been expecting. He turned toward the side wall where Nora was standing. He came to attention, heels together, the formal military posture, and he raised his right hand to his brow in a salute that was clean and deliberate and completely serious. Nora stood very still for a moment. She was in civilian clothes. She was not required to return it. She was no longer active duty, and the protocol didn't demand it. She returned it anyway. The room was silent for 2 seconds. Then someone started clapping. Nora didn't see who. It came from somewhere in the middle. And then more people joined, and then the sound built until it was 200 people in an auditorium on the second floor of a hospital that was still in the middle of a crisis, doing the only thing available to them that was commensurate with what they'd just heard and seen. Nora looked straight ahead. Her jaw was tight. The bruise on her face was visible to everyone in the room, and she was not going to cry in front of 200 colleagues, and she did not, though it cost her something to manage it. The applause ran its course. People began to move, to talk, to process, the way people do after something significant has been said and heard in a group. The room's energy shifted from the formal to the human, which was both easier and in some ways harder. Nora went to find a wall to put her back against. She was intercepted by Diane Parrish, who walked straight to her and hugged her before she could be stopped, which was not a thing Nora had been prepared for and which consequently worked. She stood there for a moment with Diane's arms around her and did not say anything and let the moment be what it was. "Okay," she said finally. "Not yet, it's not," Diane said. "But it's getting there." She was right about that. It was getting there. What neither of them knew, what was sitting in an inbox on the third floor in the office of the hospital's new interim COO, sent 20 minutes ago from a federal prosecutor's office downtown, was that the initial federal charges against Marcus Del Rey had been formalized and were broader than the arrest warrant had indicated. The procurement fraud was there. The assault charge was there. But there were 4 additional counts that had been added in the hours since the board meeting, built from documents that Roger Stills had handed over to Diane Park's office at the 2 p.m. meeting. Documents that Stills had been sitting on for 2 years, that he had decided on a Wednesday morning in October that he was no longer willing to hold. The additional counts included obstruction and witness tampering, which meant someone else was implicated, someone who was still in the building. Someone who was still in the building. That detail sat in an unread inbox on the third floor for 11 minutes before the new interim COO, a woman named Patricia Hale, who had been Hargrove's VP of Clinical Operations for 4 years, and who had spent the last 6 hours being handed a situation she had not applied for, opened her email and read it and sat back in her chair and said quietly and to no one, "Of course." She called Diane Park's direct line. Park answered on the second ring. "I was about to call you," she said. "The additional counts," Hale said. "The obstruction and tampering. Who?" "We're not releasing a name until the warrant is processed," Park said. "That's going to be within the hour. What I need from you is access to the HR records for your senior administrative staff, specifically anyone with signing authority on vendor contracts and anyone with documented access to the security footage archive." Hale was already pulling up the relevant system on her computer. "The footage archive, you mean the original files?" "The files that were accessed and partially deleted the night before the story broke," Park said. "Whoever did it wasn't sophisticated enough. The metadata survived. We have login credentials." Hale stopped typing. "The deletion attempt," Park continued, "happened at 11:47 p.m. on Tuesday, the night of the incident, before the footage aired. That's," Hale calculated, "that's before anyone outside administration would have known the footage existed." "Correct," Park said. Hale thought about who had been in the building Tuesday night. She thought about access levels and who held them and who had reason to use them. And she thought about a conversation she had had 3 weeks ago, a routine budget conversation, unremarkable at the time, except that it hadn't been entirely about the budget. She sat with that for a moment. "I'm going to need you to keep this channel open," she said to Park. "I think I know what you're going to find." She did not say the name. Not yet. Not on a phone call that she couldn't control the record of. Downstairs, Nora had detached from Diane Parrish's vicinity with the gentle but definite manner of someone who needed space to decompress and was not willing to ask for it directly. She had gone back to the emergency department, not to work, because Ramos had the floor managed and the afternoon census had stabilized, but because the emergency department was the room she thought most clearly in, the room where the priorities were legible and the noise was the right kind of noise. She found a chair at the far end of the nurse's station and sat in it and drank water from a paper cup and tried to locate the part of herself that was not tired. It was there. It was just underneath several other things. Gary Mendoza found her at 2:20. He came and sat in the chair beside her without asking, which she appreciated because it meant she didn't have to say yes or no. "Stills is upstairs with the federal investigator," he said. "I heard." "Did you know about the procurement thing before today?" "No," she said. "I knew Del Rey ran the administrative side like he owned it, which he didn't, but that's different from knowing the specifics." Gary was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a person who was working up to something. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead." "When you made that call," he said, "from the trauma bay, did you know it was going to go this far?" Nora thought about it honestly because Gary deserved an honest answer and not the clean version. "I knew something would happen," she said. "I didn't know the scale of it. I made the call because it was the right call to make. The rest of it—" She paused. "The rest of it was already there. I didn't build it. I suppose I was the thing that made it visible." Gary nodded slowly. "That's a careful way of putting it. It's the accurate way. The procurement stuff," he said. "That's years of work that he did before yesterday. Before you." "Yes." "So he was always going to fall eventually?" "Probably," she said. "Though eventually is a long time when you're on the wrong end of it." Gary looked at his hands. "I should have, when it happened. In the department. I should have stepped in." "You gave me 2 minutes," she said. That's not the same as stopping it." "No," she said. "It's not." She said it plainly, without softening it, because Gary was not a fragile person and he was not asking for softening. "But you made a decision in real time with incomplete information and a power structure above you that made intervention complicated. I don't have a simple verdict on that." He was quiet for a long moment. "I've been playing it back since yesterday morning. I know the feeling. I imagine you have a lot of practice with that," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Some," she said. They sat together for a few minutes without talking, which was its own kind of useful. The department ran around them. A shift change beginning in the far bay, the sound of a phone being answered, someone's cartwheel squeaking on the linoleum with the specific rhythm of a wheel that needed replacing. At 2:47, Patricia Hale came through the emergency department doors. Nora looked up. She had met Hale a handful of times in the context of budget reviews and one departmental safety audit, and she had formed the impression of a person who was precise and capable and politically aware in the way that people who operate in hospital administration need to be. Hale was 50, with close-cropped hair and the bearing of someone who carried responsibility without making it visible. She looked different now. Not undone, but pressed. The kind of face that happens when a person has been handling too many things at once for too many hours. She stopped in front of Nora. "I need to speak with you," she said, "in private." Nora stood. She followed Hale to the small consultation room off the main corridor, the one used for family conversations that needed walls, and Hale closed the door and turned. "You need to know something before it becomes general knowledge," Hale said. "The federal investigation has identified a second individual connected to the obstruction charges. The warrant is being processed now. It will be executed in this building within the next 45 minutes to an hour." Nora waited. "It's Dr. Stills who provided the documentation," Hale said. "But the person implicated in the tampering is not Stills. It's his administrative liaison." She said the name. "Sandra Greer." Nora absorbed this. Sandra Greer, who who had been standing behind Delray when he came into the department Tuesday morning, who had been in the room when it happened, who had access to administrative systems, and now that Nora thought about it, now that the pieces rearranged themselves with the new information, who had been notably silent in the board meeting, notably absent from the staff assembly, notable in a way that Nora hadn't registered as notable until right now. She tried to delete the footage, Nora said. She accessed the archive at 11:47 Tuesday night, Hale said. She deleted segments, but the metadata survived. Park's team recovered the login. She was trying to protect Delray, Nora said. Not a question. She was trying to protect herself, Hale said, and there was something precise and unsentimental in how she said it. The procurement irregularities. Some of the vendor approvals went through her office. She's not a peripheral figure in this. She's a participant. Nora thought about this. About a woman who had stood in an emergency department at 8 a.m. and watched her colleague get struck and had not said a single word, and then had gone home that night and tried to erase the evidence of it. The calculation involved in that. The specific, cold-blooded nature of it. Why are you telling me? Nora said. Hale looked at her steadily. Because you work in this department, and when federal agents walk through those doors to arrest a senior administrator for the second time in one day, your staff deserves not to be blindsided. And because... She paused. Because you are owed the complete picture. Everything that happened in that department on Tuesday morning, you are owed the complete picture of. Nora nodded. Also, Hale said, I wanted to tell you in person that effective immediately, your suspension is rescinded. Your position is fully reinstated with back pay for the period of the suspension. She paused. That's a formal decision. I have the paperwork. Okay, Nora said. That's all you've got? Okay. I've had a long 2 days, Nora said. Something moved across Hale's face that was almost a smile. Fair enough, she said. She left. Nora stayed in the consultation room for a moment. She sat in one of the chairs that were positioned for families receiving difficult news, and she let the information settle. Sandra Greer. Tuesday night, alone in front of a computer screen, deleting footage and believing it was enough. The desperation in that. The hours that had followed and the way they'd unfolded, and how none of it had worked, and how all of it was about to become very public. She thought about what Colt had said in the auditorium, that the conduct she'd witnessed was what happened when institutions allowed authority to become disconnected from accountability. She thought about the fact that at 7:43 on Tuesday morning, she had been doing her job, which was the thing she did every day, and that the sequence of events that had followed had exposed not one failure, but a system of them, a layered and interconnected structure that had been functioning for years inside an institution that moved around it and pretended not to see it. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Not what Delray had done. That was clear and its consequences were in motion. The thing she kept coming back to was how long it had been running, how many meetings, how many signatures, how many people who had known something was wrong and had made the decision over and over that it wasn't their problem to solve. She stood up. She went back to the department. At 3:17 p.m., Roger Stills came out of his meeting with Diane Park on the 4th floor and walked to the elevator with his personal attorney beside him and his face carrying the look of a man who had made a decision he wasn't certain was right, but was certain was necessary. He pressed the button for the lobby. He did not go back to his office. His attorney would handle the next steps, and the steps after that, and the ones after that were going to be what they were going to be, and he was past the point of changing them. The elevator doors closed. At 3:29, Sandra Greer was in her office on the 2nd floor when she became aware that the quality of the afternoon had shifted in a way she couldn't immediately name. She had been in her office since 10 a.m., working, or performing the performance of working, which was not the same thing but occupied the same desk. And she had tracked the day's developments with the increasingly tight focus of someone watching a fire approach from a direction they'd misjudged. She had not been in the board meeting. She had not been in the staff assembly. She had sent 2 texts to Delray's personal phone that had not been delivered, which she had understood by 10 a.m. meant his phone was no longer in his possession. She had spent the hours since managing the specific, nauseating arithmetic of a person calculating whether what they'd done was discoverable, whether the answer to that question had changed since last night, and what the options looked like if it had. The metadata. She had not thought about the metadata. She had thought about the footage files, about the segments, about the login. She had used her own credentials because she had been in a hurry, and she had not thought clearly, and she had understood that mistake by 8 a.m. and had been living inside it since. Her phone rang. It was her personal attorney, whom she had called at 9 a.m. out of the same instinct that had made Delray call his. The attorney's voice was careful and did not bury the lead. The warrant had been issued. She needed to come to his office. She needed to do it now, before... She was still on the phone when her office door opened. Two people. One she recognized as affiliated with the Federal Inspector General's office because she'd seen the credentials in the board meeting that morning. The other was an agent she did not recognize. She ended the call. "Ms. Greer," the first one said. She put the phone down on the desk. Her hand was steady, which she noted with a distant, clinical sort of awareness. The way you note irrelevant details when the relevant ones are too large to process all at once. "I'd like to call my attorney," she said. "You can do that," the agent said. "You'll need to come with us first." She stood. She picked up her bag from the chair beside the desk and then put it back down, because she understood she was not going to need her bag, and the gesture of picking it up had been automatic and was now just evidence of how automatic things were when the ground dropped out. She smoothed the front of her blazer. She walked to the door. The corridor outside her office was not empty. It was not a crowd. This wasn't a perp walk engineered for spectacle. But the second floor of a functioning hospital is never empty at 3:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, and the people who were there, walking between offices and departments and the elevator bank, registered the federal agents flanking Sandra Greer in the specific way that humans register things that don't belong in a familiar landscape. People stopped. People watched. She walked past them with her eyes forward and her shoulders straight because she was not going to let them have more than she had to give them. And the agents moved with her at a pace that was professional and not aggressive. And the whole thing took 40 seconds from her office door to the elevator. And then the elevator opened and she stepped in and the doors closed and the corridor resumed its business. But the corridor did not actually resume its business. It talked. It texted. It moved through the building the way things moved through hospitals, which was through the invisible network of people who were in the right place at the right time and who had phones and colleagues. And within 4 minutes, the emergency department knew. And within 7 minutes, the fourth floor knew. And within 12 minutes, it had reached the group of board members who were still in Patricia Hale's conference room, working through the afternoon's administrative aftermath. Hale received the confirmation from Park's office by text at 3:33. She read it, replied with a single word, "Confirmed," and set her phone face down. She looked at the 3 board members across the table from her. "Sandra Greer has been taken into federal custody," she said. "Obstruction, tampering, and 3 counts related to the procurement investigation." She paused. "I'd like to keep this meeting focused on what comes next for the institution, which is where our attention is most useful right now." One of the board members, a man named Whitfield, who had been on the board for 6 years and who had voted for Delray's termination that morning with the expression of someone eating something that didn't agree with him, sat back in his chair and exhaled. "How deep does this go?" he said. "We'll know more as the investigation develops," Hale said. "What I can tell you is that we've retained outside counsel to conduct an internal audit. We've suspended access credentials for anyone named in the federal documents pending review, and I've asked Park's office for a preliminary scope assessment by end of week." She looked at him directly. "The answer to your question is deep enough that we're going to spend the next 6 months finding out exactly how deep." "And the staff?" "The staff is doing what they always do," Hale said. "They're taking care of patients." She was right. In the emergency department, the afternoon shift was running. A man in his 50s had come in with what turned out to be a kidney stone, which was agonizing and treatable and required a specific sequence of imaging and medication and monitoring that occupied 2 nurses and a physician for the better part of 90 minutes. A teenager with a sprained ankle that she'd been walking on for 3 days because she'd told her parents she was fine. An elderly woman with a medication interaction that her pharmacist had missed and that her daughter had caught, which was lucky. Nora was not officially on shift. She was not supposed to be working. She had stayed because the afternoon was busy, and because the suspension paperwork hadn't fully processed through the system yet, and because, more honestly, she didn't know where else to be. The apartment felt far away. The idea of sitting in her car in the parking structure again felt actively wrong. Ramos had looked at her at 3 p.m. and said, "You realize you don't have to be here." "I know," she said, "but you're going to stay." For a little while. He'd handed her a chart without another word. At 4:15, she was updating notes at the nurse's station when her phone buzzed. She picked it up, expecting Diane or her sister or the JAG officer with a follow-up question about the statement. It was a name she hadn't seen in 4 years. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, former Navy, who had served in the same operational unit she had during her second deployment. She had not heard from Webb since a brief exchange at a mutual colleague's wedding in 2020, and before that their contact had been sporadic and professional, the kind of connection that military service builds and civilian life slowly dilutes. She looked at his name on the screen for a moment. She answered. "Webb," she said. "Commander." He still used the rank. Some people always would. "I saw the coverage." "Most people did." "I'm calling because—" He stopped. She could hear him choosing his words, which was not a thing Webb usually needed to do. "I'm calling because I was stationed at Hansfield Naval Station for the last 14 months. I PCS'd out in September." Hansfield Naval Station was 40 miles from Hargrove Medical Center. "Okay," she said, because there was more coming and she could hear it. "While I was there," Webb said, "there was a contracting situation, hospital services procurement, a vendor bidding process that went sideways in a way I flagged to my CO and was told to leave alone." His voice was even. "The vendor that won that contract, the company name, it's in the federal filings that came out this afternoon." Nora was still for a moment. "The same network," she said. "The same network," he confirmed. "Voss. This isn't just a hospital administrator running a side scheme. If the vendor connects to Hansfield, it connects to federal defense contracts. That's a different magnitude." She set down her pen. She had thought she understood the shape of what had happened. She had thought, and it had been reasonable to think this, given what had come out through the morning and afternoon, that this was a corrupt hospital executive with a procurement scheme and a short fuse, and that the events of Tuesday morning had exposed it, and that the machinery of accountability was now doing what it was supposed to do. She had thought she could see the edges of it. "How solid is your connection?" she said. "Solid enough that I spent this afternoon talking to a JAG attorney," Webb said. "She told me to sit tight until she'd reviewed the federal filings. She called me back 40 minutes ago." "And?" "She said the scope of the investigation is going to expand," Webb said. "Significantly." Nora looked at the department around her. The boards, the patients, the nurses moving between bays with the practiced, unremarkable efficiency of people who did hard things every day and called it normal. She thought about the procurement files, the vendor network, the defense contracts that sat somewhere beyond the edges of what she'd been thinking about. She thought about the fact that Marcus Del Rey was sitting in federal custody right now, and that Sandra Greer was sitting in federal custody, and that Roger Stills was cooperating, and that the investigation that had started as an 8-month anonymous disclosure was now, apparently, something considerably larger. She thought about Tuesday morning, about the boy on the gurney, about the 2 minutes in the trauma bay. She thought about how a single moment could have a shadow much longer than the moment itself. "Webb," she said. "Send me the JAG attorney's name." "Already did," he said. "Check your email." She ended the call and opened her email. Webb's message was there, 3 lines, the attorney's name and contact, and a note that said, "She's expecting your call. She said to tell you it's bigger than you think." Nora put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the board. She looked at the names and numbers and the organized flow of a department that was, against everything the last 2 days had thrown at it, still functioning, still doing the thing it existed to do. She picked up a chart and walked back toward Bay 3, where the elderly woman with the medication interaction was waiting on her second round of blood work. And she did the thing she always did, which was put the next right thing in front of her and move toward it. But her mind was already somewhere else. It was on a defense contract, on a vendor network that reached beyond a hospital's administrative wing to a naval installation 40 miles away. On the question of how long it had been running, how many people had touched it, how many had flagged it and been told to leave it alone. On the question of who exactly had benefited most, and whether that person was already in custody, or whether they hadn't been looked at yet, That question didn't leave her. It sat in the back of her mind the way urgent things sat when she was working, present, patient, waiting for the moment she could give it proper attention. She finished the blood work review on the woman in Bay 3, confirmed the medication interaction was resolving with the adjusted protocol, and spoke briefly with the woman's daughter, who had driven 2 hours and arrived looking like she'd driven 2 hours, and was now sitting in a chair beside the bed, with her mother's hand in both of hers, and the particular exhausted relief of someone who had been right about something they desperately hoped to be wrong about. "She's stable," Nora told her. "The new medication schedule needs to be followed exactly. I'm going to make sure the discharge paperwork has it written out clearly, not in medical shorthand." "Thank you," the daughter said. Then, because she had apparently been in the building long enough to have heard something of the day's events, "Are you the nurse from the news?" Nora paused for one beat. "I work here," she said, which was both accurate and sufficient. She finished her notes at 5:40 and handed off cleanly to the evening team. Ramos was still there. He'd extended his shift by mutual agreement with the incoming attending, a quiet, efficient woman named Dr. Lim, who had absorbed the day's atmosphere without comment and gotten to work immediately. Nora gave Lim a thorough overview of every active case, the same way she always did, and Lim took notes and asked 2 specific questions, and that was that. Ramos caught her at the door. "Get some sleep," he said. "I will." "Boss?" He said it the way people say a name when they mean something else. "You did good work today, not the stuff everyone's talking about. In here, with Sophie Brandt." She looked at him. "You made the right call," she said, "letting me lead when you didn't have to." "You had 11 pediatric chest tubes on me," he said. "That's not ego, that's math. It takes a certain kind of person to think that way under pressure." He shrugged, slightly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Go home." She went. The parking structure was quiet. The evening light came through the open sides at a low angle and made the concrete look less institutional than it did during the day, which was a minor mercy. She sat in her car and called the JAG attorney whose name Webb had sent, a woman named Lieutenant Commander Priya Okonkwo, who answered professionally and efficiently and got to the relevant information in under 3 minutes. The vendor network, Okonkwo explained, had been traced through 6 entities across 3 states. 2 of those entities had active contracts with federal defense installations, of which Hansfield was one. The financial forensics team working under Park's office had been building the defense side connection since that afternoon, which was why the scope assessment Hale had requested by end of week was going to come back larger than anticipated. "What does this mean for the current defendants?" Nora asked. "Delray and Greer are looking at significantly expanded charges," Okonkwo said. "The federal prosecutor's office is coordinating with the DoD Inspector General now. This isn't going to resolve in weeks. This is a months-long process, possibly longer. And the people above them in the network? That's what the investigation is designed to find," Okonkwo said. "Your role in that process, Commander, is as a witness to the specific conduct on Tuesday. The broader network investigation proceeds independently. You don't carry that." "I know," Nora said. "I just wanted the complete picture." "I understand that," Okonkwo said, and said it in a way that suggested she did. Nora drove home. She showered, which was something she had been wanting to do since Tuesday morning and had not had the opportunity to do in any way that felt complete. She stood under the hot water for longer than she normally allowed herself and let the day come apart slightly, the way things do when you've been holding them together through sustained effort and finally put them down. She thought about Webb's call, about the vendor network, about the way a system of corruption doesn't build in a day and doesn't fall in a day, and the people who benefit most from it are rarely the ones standing closest to the visible failure. She thought about Marcus Teller, who was on the pediatric floor recovering, and Sophie Brandt, who was in the ICU but stable, and the woman in Bay 3 who would go home tomorrow with a medication list written in plain language. She ate something, which she had also not properly done since Tuesday morning. Scrambled eggs and toast at 7 p.m., which was unglamorous and correct. She called her sister, who picked up immediately and asked 17 questions in a row, and then cried a little and then apologized for crying, and Nora told her not to apologize, and they talked for 40 minutes about things that were not the hospital, and not the footage, and not the Admiral or the board meeting, and at the end her sister said, "I just want you to know that I've always known you were the toughest person I know." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure tough is the right word," she said. "What's the right word?" She thought about it. "Present," she said finally. "I think the right word is present." She slept for 7 hours, which was more than she'd slept in a single stretch in a long time, and if she dreamed, she didn't remember it. The next 3 weeks moved with the particular quality of time during an active federal investigation, which is to say they moved both quickly and slowly depending on which part you were in. The formal legal machinery was slow: indictments, arraignments, the careful procedural architecture of a prosecution that was being built to last. The institutional response at Hargrove was faster, because institutions under public scrutiny move faster than they do at any other time, which is its own kind of commentary on institutions. Patricia Hale was confirmed as permanent COO by a unanimous board vote on the second Friday after the incident. She announced 3 structural changes on the same day: an independent ethics hotline managed by an outside firm, a clinical autonomy policy that explicitly protected medical staff from administrative override in patient care decisions, and a complete audit of vendor contract processes going back 5 years. She sent an all-staff email that was 3 paragraphs long and did not contain any corporate language, which several people noted was itself significant. Roger Stills's cooperation with the federal investigation was formalized into a plea agreement that included a fine, a 2-year suspension of his medical license, and 5 years probation. His attorney put out a statement. Stills himself did not make public comments. He resigned from Hargrove the same week and left quietly, and the people who worked around him had varying reactions that ranged from contempt to a complicated sympathy, and most landed somewhere between the two, because that's where most human reactions to human failure actually land. The vendor network took longer to unravel because it was designed to take longer. 6 weeks after Tuesday, the federal prosecutor's office issued a supplementary indictment that added 4 names to the case: 2 executives at vendor companies and 2 former administrative officials, one of whom had left Hargrove 18 months earlier and one of whom was still working in hospital administration at a different institution in another state, who was immediately placed on leave pending the investigation. The scale of the financial fraud, when the preliminary figures were released in the court filing, was larger than the initial estimate by a factor that made the regional coverage national again. Marcus Delray was denied bail at his arraignment on the grounds that the prosecution successfully argued flight risk, citing financial assets held in entities outside the state. He sat in custody through the pre-trial process, which was its own particular consequence for a man who had spent 15 years in positions where what he said determined what happened next. His attorney released a statement calling the charges disproportionate. The statement received minimal traction. Sandra Greer accepted a plea agreement in the 5th week: obstruction, evidence tampering, and 2 counts of procurement fraud. The agreement included 30 months in federal custody, 3 years supervised release, and permanent disqualification from any position with federal healthcare contractor oversight authority. She made no public statement. Her attorney said she accepted responsibility. The metadata that had survived her deletion attempt was cited in the plea agreement as the primary evidence. Nora read about these developments the way she read things that were relevant but no longer immediately in front of her, with attention and without urgency, because the urgency had been in the moment and the moment was past. She was back on full shift. The department had normalized in the way that emergency departments normalize, which is to say the work continued and the work was enough to occupy the present almost completely. And the events of Tuesday became the kind of thing that was referenced occasionally, and with varying degrees of tact by various people, and was otherwise absorbed into the texture of the place. She checked on Marcus Teller twice during his recovery. He was discharged on the 4th day post-surgery, walking out of the pediatric ward with his father and a backpack someone had brought from home, and the slightly dazed, cheerful quality of a 9-year-old who had been in the hospital long enough to find it boring. Dale Teller shook Nora's hand with both of his when he saw her in the corridor, a grip that said things his voice didn't quite manage, and Marcus looked at her with the straightforward curiosity of a child who hasn't learned yet to perform gratitude. "Did it hurt?" he asked, looking at the bruise, which had faded to a faint yellowish shadow by then. "A little," she said. "I had surgery," he said with some pride. "I know, you did great." He seemed satisfied with that. They went home. Sophie Brandt spent 6 days in the ICU before she was transferred to the pediatric ward. Her recovery was not simple. A chest tube in a 7-year-old is not a procedure without aftermath, and there were 2 days in the second week where her progress plateaued in a way that concerned the team and required adjustment of her protocol. But she moved in the right direction overall, incrementally, and with the specific resilience that children have that adults look at and don't fully understand. And at the end of the third week, she was discharged with a follow-up schedule and a stuffed animal that one of the pediatric nurses had given her, and which she carried under one arm with the authority of someone who had earned it. Anna Brandt sent a card to the emergency department. It was addressed to Nora and the team and said less than it meant, the way cards usually do, but it said it in the direct and unadorned way that the woman herself spoke, and it was taped to the inside of the break room cabinet for a while before someone moved it somewhere, and nobody tracked where it went, which was the fate of most such cards and didn't diminish what they were. The formal hearing came in the 7th week. It was not a trial. The trial would come later, for both Del Rey and Greer, when the prosecution was ready and the defense had exhausted its preliminary motions. What came in the 7th week was a federal administrative proceeding related to the healthcare fraud component of the case, which required formal witness testimony, and which Nora had known was coming since Rebecca Farrow had told her in the first week. She prepared the way she prepared for things that mattered, which was to be precise and thorough and to not construct a story around the facts, but to let the facts be the shape of the story. She reviewed her statement from the first week. She spoke with Okonkwo twice. She went over the timeline of Tuesday morning until she could move through it in the exact sequence without hesitation, because hesitation in testimony gets interpreted as uncertainty, and uncertainty gets exploited. The proceeding was held in a federal building downtown, in a room that looked like every conference room in every federal building, which is to say utilitarian and slightly too warm. There were attorneys on both sides, a federal hearing officer, and a court reporter whose typing was the primary sound in the room between questions. Del Rey was present. He was required to be. He looked different from the man who had walked into the emergency department 7 weeks ago. Not broken. She didn't think he was the kind of person who broke in a visible way, but contracted somehow. Smaller in the way that people get smaller when the context that made them large has been removed. His attorney sat beside him and occasionally leaned over to say something, and Del Rey listened with the careful attention of a man who had learned to listen to his attorney in a way he'd never learned to listen to anyone else. Nora gave her testimony in 53 minutes. She was asked to describe her actions on the morning of the incident. She described them in order, without editorializing. She was asked to describe what had occurred when Del Rey entered the department. She described it. She was asked about the conversation, about the strike, about the 2 minutes in the trauma bay, about the phone call. She answered each question directly and completely and did not expand beyond the question, because expanding beyond the question is where testimony gets complicated. Del Rey's attorney cross-examined her for 12 minutes. The cross-examination was designed to establish that her decision to deny Del Rey's request had been a matter of professional judgment rather than established protocol, which was technically accurate and also completely beside the point. And the hearing officer knew it, and the federal prosecutor knew it, and Nora answered each question accurately without letting it become a debate, because a debate was what the attorney wanted, and accuracy was what the record needed. At one point, Del Rey's attorney said, "Isn't it true that hospital policy gives administrative leadership authority to allocate resources in non-emergency situations?" "Your nephew's injury wasn't the situation I was managing," Nora said. "I was managing a 9-year-old in a ruptured appendix. That's not a non-emergency situation." "You made that determination unilaterally." "That's what clinical judgment is," she said. "Yes." The attorney moved on. When it was over, she walked out of the conference room and into the corridor and found Admiral Colt waiting outside. He had attended as a character witness and had given his own testimony earlier in the day, and he was standing in the corridor in civilian clothes, the first time she'd seen him without the uniform since the Pacific, which made him look like a version of himself that was slightly more recognizable as a person. "How'd it go?" he said. "Fine," she said. "That's it?" "It went fine," she said. "The facts are the facts. I told them the facts." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you ready for the next part?" She had known the next part was coming. Okonkwo had told her. Hale had told her. It had been reported in the national coverage, and she had read about it with the same attention she read about everything related to this case, which was careful and without the emotional investment that would have made it harder to process. The United States Navy was conducting its own parallel proceeding regarding the Hansfield defense contracts. Not a criminal proceeding, that was the federal prosecutor's jurisdiction, but an administrative investigation into whether any active or reserve military personnel had been involved in steering contracts toward the vendor network. Webb had provided his testimony. 3 other former personnel had come forward in the weeks following, which was more than had been expected, and suggested the network had operated at a level that touched military procurement in ways that the Hargrove piece had only been the visible surface of. Nora had been asked to serve as a civilian liaison to the Navy's review panel. Not as a subject of investigation, her record was not in question, but as someone who could bridge the clinical and operational contexts, who understood both the hospital side and the military side, who could interpret for each what the other was saying when the language didn't translate cleanly. She had thought about it for 4 days before she said yes. Not because she wasn't willing. She was willing, but she understood what it would mean for the shape of the next period of her life, which would be different from the shape she'd built in 6 years at Hargrove, and she wanted to make the decision deliberately rather than reactively, because she had spent enough of the last 7 weeks reacting to things, and she intended to choose this one clearly. She had said yes because the work mattered, because Webb had flagged something and been told to leave it alone, and she understood what it meant to be told to leave something alone when the something was wrong, and she was not willing to be another person who did. "I'm ready," she told Colt. "It's going to take time," he said. "The review panel. Months, probably. It won't be clean." "I know." "You'll still be here? At the hospital?" "Part-time for now," she said. Hale approved the arrangement, 2 shifts a week. He nodded. He looked at her in the way he sometimes did, the way that was more assessment than sentiment, but contained both. "You know what struck me," he said, "when you called from the trauma bay?" "What?" "You gave me the facts, and then you said, 'I have a situation.'" He paused. Not, "He hit me," not, "I need help." You said, "I have a situation." She considered this. It was a situation. Most people would have led with the hit, he said. The hit wasn't what needed solving, she said. The situation was what needed solving. He was quiet for a moment. "That's why you're good at this," he said. She didn't answer that. She never quite knew what to do with that kind of statement, which was its own kind of data about her, and she was aware of it. The trial of Marcus Del Rey began 4 months after the incident in a federal courthouse 11 miles from Hargrove Medical Center, on a gray February morning when the trees were still bare and the parking structures were full of press vehicles and the line of people waiting for public seating in the gallery moved slowly in the cold. The trial ran for 3 weeks. The prosecution presented the security footage on the 3rd day, which the national coverage led with again, because footage that clear tends to anchor a narrative regardless of how much more complex the surrounding case is. The clinical experts testified that Nora's decision to prioritize Marcus Teller over Del Rey's nephew had been not only ethically correct but medically unambiguous. Delay in that situation, the attending expert said, would have constituted a departure from the standard of care, and the outcome would likely have been significantly worse. Harper testified about the surgery. He was precise and technical, and on cross-examination he said flatly, "The timing of that surgery was appropriate. Any delay would have concerned me." Dale Teller testified. He was not a polished witness. He spoke slowly and looked at the jury when he talked, and twice he had to stop and take a breath. And he was, for those reasons, probably the most effective witness of the first week. He talked about the morning, about running beside the gurney, about a nurse who told him his son was in good hands and meant it, about sitting in the waiting room while Harpy was in surgery, about what it had felt like to learn, afterward, what had happened to that nurse while his son was still in the operating room. "She could have left," Dale said. "Right after. I would have understood, but she stayed and finished what she was doing. She made sure everyone was covered before she left." The prosecutor didn't ask a follow-up question. She didn't need to. Nora testified on the 9th day. She walked into the courtroom in dark slacks and a plain blouse and sat in the witness box and answered questions for 3 hours with the same quality she'd brought to every other formal context since the beginning of this: present, precise, unembellished. She described Tuesday morning in the sequence it had happened. She described the conversation with Del Rey. She described the strike. When the prosecutor asked her how she had felt in the moment after it happened, she was quiet for a few seconds. "I assessed the situation," she said. "Can you be more specific about what that means?" "It means I registered what had happened and I made a decision about what to do next," she said. "What I felt is, I'm not sure that's the useful part. The useful part is what I did." "What did you do?" "I went back to my patient," she said. "That's what needed doing." The courtroom was quiet. On cross-examination, Delray's attorney tried the same approach he'd used in the administrative hearing, pressing on clinical autonomy, on chain of command, on whether her decision had been within the scope of her authority. She answered the same way she'd answered before, accurately and without argumentation, and the jury watched her do it with the focused attention of 12 people who were working. Delray did not testify. That was his right, and his attorney exercised it, and the prosecution did not comment on it beyond the standard instruction to the jury about what they could and could not infer. The closing arguments took 2 days. The prosecution's closer spent 40 minutes on the procurement fraud, the financial scale of it, the duration, the deliberateness, and 10 minutes on the assault, not because it was less significant, but because it needed less argument. The footage was the argument. He struck a decorated combat veteran in front of 30 witnesses, the prosecutor said, because she refused to compromise the medical care of a 9-year-old child, and then he tried to use the authority of his position to make the consequences disappear. She paused. The consequences did not disappear. They multiplied. Because that is what happens when people in power confuse the authority to sign documents with the authority to determine what is right. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. They came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Delray was convicted of felony assault, procurement fraud across 3 fiscal years, wire fraud, conspiracy, and 2 counts related to the defense contract network, charges that had been added in the final superseding indictment 6 weeks before trial. The combined sentencing guidelines were substantial, and when the judge announced them 3 weeks later in a courtroom that was quieter than most people expected, the number that came back was 12 years in federal custody, with eligibility for review at 8 pending conduct, plus restitution orders that ran to 7 figures and the permanent revocation of any executive license in federally regulated healthcare systems. 12 years. Nora was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. She had been present for the verdict, which was what she had needed to be present for. And the sentencing was a procedural conclusion to a case that had already, in the factual sense, been decided. She was at Hargrove when it was announced, on one of her 2 weekly shifts, standing at the nurse's station reviewing a chart when Diane came and stood beside her and showed her the notification on her phone. She read it. She handed the phone back. 12 years, Diane said. Yes, Nora said. Is that... Diane searched for the word. Is that what you expected? It's what the evidence supported, Nora said. Diane looked at her. That's not the same as what I asked. Nora thought about it. I didn't think about a number, she said honestly. I thought about accountability. The number is the accountability. So yes, I think it's what should have happened. She went back to the chart. Sandra Greer reported to federal custody the same week the verdict came in, as the terms of her plea agreement required. There was no coverage of it. She had not been a public figure in the way Delray had been, and the plea meant there had been no trial. And without a trial, there was no daily coverage. And without daily coverage, the public attention moved to the next thing, which was its own kind of commentary. She went in quietly, and that was that. The 2 vendor executives named in the supplementary indictment were tried separately, 4 months later, and convicted on federal fraud charges. The former Hargrove administrative official, who had left 18 months before the incident, pleaded guilty to 1 count and received a fine and probation and the end of a career that had already ended when his name appeared in the court filings. The official at the other institution was terminated by his hospital's board and is currently awaiting trial. The Hansfield Defense Contract Review closed 8 months after it opened. It found that 2 contracts had been improperly steered toward vendor entities connected to the network, resulting in financial damages to the federal government that were referred to the DoD Inspector General for recovery. 3 individuals with peripheral involvement received administrative sanctions. No active duty personnel were charged with criminal conduct, which the review panel's summary noted was a finding that reflected both the limits of what could be proven and the limits of what had occurred, meaning that the primary steering mechanism had been civilian, not military, and that the military personnel who had raised flags had, in fact, raised them, and had been told to leave it alone by people outside the chain of command. Webb received a formal commendation for his initial disclosure. He came to Hargrove once, briefly, to meet Nora for coffee in the cafeteria, and they sat across from each other in the mid-morning lull and talked about things that weren't the case for a while, and then about things that were, And he said at one point, "I've been thinking about what I should have done differently, in real time, when I was still at Hansfield." "You flagged it," she said. "I flagged it, and then I left it alone when they told me to." "You were a lieutenant," she said, "in a chain of command, and you flagged it. That's not nothing." "It's not enough either," he said. "No," she said. "But not enough isn't the same as nothing. You have to know the difference, or you'll spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for someone else's failure." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that something you worked out for yourself?" "I'm working on it," she said. "It takes time." The review panel work occupied her for 8 months. 2 weeks of each month spent in coordination with the panel's lead investigator and the JAG team, the rest at Hargrove in the emergency department. It was not glamorous work. It was documentation review and witness coordination, and the translation of clinical language into legal language and back again. And it was slow in the way that correct work is slow, and there were weeks where the progress felt invisible. But she had done invisible work before. She knew what it looked like from the inside, and she knew it didn't feel like much until it did. The panel's final report was submitted to the DoD Inspector General in late spring. It was 47 pages. Nora was credited in the acknowledgments as a civilian liaison whose contribution to the clinical and operational analysis had been significant. She read the acknowledgment once and did not read it again. The work was the work. The acknowledgment was just paper. What mattered was what changed. The Hansfield procurement process was overhauled. 2 other installations implemented similar reviews as a precautionary measure. The federal healthcare vendor oversight framework that had been in discussion for years was accelerated into rulemaking, driven in part by the Hargrove case, which had been cited in the rulemaking proposal 17 times as a case study in what inadequate oversight produced. None of this happened quickly. None of it was clean. None of it reversed the years in which it had been running. But it happened, and it was real. And the difference between what had existed before Tuesday morning and what existed after was measurable and documented and would outlast the immediate noise of the coverage and the trial and the sentencing by a significant margin. Nora returned to full-time at Hargrove in the fall. Hale had offered her a position on the newly formed Clinical Ethics Advisory Panel, which met monthly and reviewed cases where clinical and administrative interests had come into tension. She accepted and attended the first meeting in October, 1 year and 2 weeks after the incident, in a conference room on the 3rd floor that she had been in before under different circumstances. There were 8 people around the table: physicians, nurses, an ethicist from the university, 1 board member. Hale chaired it. The first case on the agenda was a disagreement between a department head and the billing office over a documentation practice that the department head believed was being driven by revenue rather than patient outcome. Nora listened to the case. She asked 3 questions. She offered her perspective in the direct, unembellished way that was simply how she thought. And the other people around the table listened, and the discussion that followed was better for what she'd said. And the outcome for the patient in that case was better because of the discussion. That was it. That was the thing. Not the footage, not the Admiral's salute, not the 12-year sentence or the 47-page report or the rulemaking acknowledgement. Those things were real, and they had mattered, and some of them would matter for a long time. But the thing that was actually the shape of her life, the thing that had been the shape of her life in the Navy and was the shape of it now, was this: being in the room, being present, asking the right questions, and refusing to leave the patient unattended. She drove home after the ethics panel meeting in October traffic, which in this city meant 40 minutes of stop and go on the overpass, and she sat in it without frustration because she had spent enough of her life in conditions that made traffic seem trivial that she had genuinely lost the ability to be bothered by it. She listened to the radio, something without words, and thought about the next shift and the patient in Bay 4 who had come in twice this week, and whose situation was more complicated than the presenting complaint suggested, and who she intended to spend some time on tomorrow. She thought about Marcus Teller, who had sent a card to the department in September. His handwriting, not his father's, slightly wobbly and completely sincere, that said he wanted to be a doctor when he grew up. She had read it in the break room and felt something she didn't have a precise name for, something in the territory of continuity, the sense that what you do moves forward in ways you can't always track. She thought about Sophie Brandt, who had been back twice for follow-up, and who no longer carried the stuffed animal under her arm, but who had, at the second visit, shown Nora the scar from the chest tube with the pride of someone displaying proof of something survived. Nora had looked at it seriously and told her it would fade, but would probably always be visible, and that was nothing to be embarrassed about.
"Does yours fade?" Sophie had asked, meaning the bruise, which had long since disappeared entirely. "It did," Nora said. "Did it take long?" "No," she said. "Not long."
She got home. She made dinner, something that required actual cooking this time, not scrambled eggs. She had been eating better, sleeping more consistently, running 3 mornings a week, none of which she had planned or announced, but all of which had started in the weeks after the trial when she had looked at the shape of her days and decided she wanted them to be different in some practical ways. Her sister called during dinner and she ate with the phone propped against the fruit bowl, and they talked about her sister's kids and a trip her sister was planning and a book her sister was reading that she wanted Nora to read too so they could talk about it. "Are you happy?" her sister asked at some point, slightly out of nowhere, but not really. Nora considered it. She thought about what happy meant in the specific way she'd always thought about what words meant, which was exactly. She wasn't sure happy was precisely right. She was something. She was doing work that mattered and doing it in a way she believed in and living in a way she had chosen deliberately rather than fallen into, and the bruise had faded and the boy had grown up a little, and the system that had been running in the dark had been pulled at least partially into the light. She was not unaware that the light had cost her something. She was not unaware that the process of the last year had taken things, sleep, steadiness, the specific piece of anonymity, that didn't fully come back. She was not going to pretend that accountability was free or that justice was clean or that the right outcome and the easy outcome were the same thing, because she had never believed that and the last year had not made her start. But she was still here. She was still in the room. She still showed up on Wednesday mornings and cared about what was in front of her and refused to leave the patient unattended, not when someone in authority told her to, not when it cost her something, not even when it cost her something she hadn't planned to spend. "Yeah," she said. "I think I am." Her sister made a sound that was relief and warmth combined. "Good," her sister said. "You deserve it." Nora didn't say anything to that. She looked at the window where the October dark had settled in and thought that deserve was another word that didn't quite fit the shape of what she understood about the world. People didn't always get what they deserved. The boy in the back seat of the car on Route 9 didn't deserve a pickup truck running a red light. The 9-year-old didn't deserve a ruptured appendix. Marcus Del Rey didn't deserve 15 years of institutional protection for corruption that moved money out of healthcare and into private pockets. The world wasn't organized around Desert. What it was organized around was what she had come to believe not as an abstraction, but as a thing demonstrated by evidence, by the experience of being the kind of person who stayed in the room when the room was difficult, was that decisions accumulated. That what you did when it was easier not to do it built something incrementally over time that was either worth building or wasn't. That the specific choice to refuse to leave the patient in front of you, regardless of who was telling you to, regardless of what it cost, that choice was not heroic. It was just correct. And correct choices made consistently, over time, in the small rooms and the large ones, were what accountability actually looked like when it was working. Not the footage, not the sentencing, not the Admiral's salute, the choice in the room. She finished her dinner, she washed the dish. She went to bed at a reasonable hour and set her alarm for 6, because she had a shift at 7 and there were patients who needed someone present, and she intended to be there. She always intended to be there. That was the whole thing, really. That had always been the whole thing. Not the rank she'd held, not the operations she'd survived, not the commendations that had been photographed without her in them. Not the 12 years in a federal sentence or the 47 pages submitted to an inspector general or the ethics panel or any of the structures that had been built and adjusted and reformed in the aftermath of a Tuesday morning in October. Just a woman who showed up and cared about what was in front of her and refused to move when moving would have cost someone else their life. The people who thought that was small had simply never seen what it built.